Hosting today's panel is a dear friend of mine. I listened to John's podcast for hours and hours and hours. He was a really big inspiration for me to start my own podcast. My podcast is called Once Bitten. I started that in January 2020. My daughter asks the first question on each show. She's been doing that since she was 9. She's now 13. She's interviewed them all, including Uncle John. So let's bring him out. Ladies and gentlemen, from Bitcoin Rapid Fire Podcast, John Vallis. Then we'll bring out the Prince himself, Prince Filip of Serbia, who you might know from dropping a Bitcoin monologue on a chat show. We'll bring out Rune Østgård, who is the author of the book Fraud Coin. If you've not read that book, you should, and he will be signing it in the book corner. Then we'll bring out Erik, Cason, the anarchist of the house. Erik Cason, ladies and gentlemen. And finally, Broyles, who's been putting out some fire content, educating us all about Bitcoin. Thank you, guys. Over to you, John.
This on? Perfect. Well, first of all, I just want to get this started by saying it's so fucking awesome to be here. I have been hiding away in my home most of the time. I don't like to travel. The world is a bit crazy these days. And it's so refreshing to come out and hang out and meet so many of you people. It's, like I've said a long time ago, I feel like Bitcoin is my country and Bitcoiners are my countrymen. And so it's so amazing to get together and hang out and eat and drink and be merry with all of you. So thank you. So I think a lot of us are probably in a similar position where in order to, we first get hooked by Bitcoin. We're not really sure what to make of it. And we have to try to contextualize it in some way. And of course, the history of money, the history of politics, the history of economics is a part of that process of contextualization. And so studying history becomes, I think, a very interesting thing for many of us. And I was trying to think in advance of this panel, like, what is it about history that we don't seem to be learning that causes us to fall into the same traps over and over again? We're told that the arc of history bends toward justice or freedom or prosperity. And that seems intuitively right, and like when you're taught in school or when someone says it, you're like, yeah, that's probably right. But it might not feel that way if you live in Venezuela, if you live in Nigeria, if you live in Egypt, if you lived anywhere during COVID. It might not feel like the world is bending towards justice, or it just does that automatically. Maybe someone in the Middle Ages, had they caught wind of what was going on in ancient Crete and the Minoan culture 3,000 years prior, might have said, that seemed a lot fucking better, actually. So are things bending towards justice and freedom? And I think this will be my initial perspective on this topic, is maybe one of the reasons why we continue to fall into the same traps and continue to make the same mistakes is that we de facto presume, there's an implicit assumption that because we're at the chain tip, if you will, of history, that all of the lessons of history have been integrated. And we have a hubris and an arrogance perhaps about that. And we don't sufficiently go back through history, try to learn the lessons, and integrate them primarily and most importantly into our own lives. And I think, we'll get into this discussion, but I do think that that's one of the things that cause us to repeat some of these things. And hopefully we'll discuss why Bitcoin helps us perhaps transcend those traps that we've continuously fallen into over the last 5, 10, 20,000 years of history. So I'm going to hand it over to my friend Prince Filip first and just say, as you studied Bitcoin, as you've been going through this process yourself, what do you think it is that we fail to learn from history?
I think number one is lack of education. I think that's the key to understanding history. There's a huge lack of education all over the world. I think that in my situation, well, in Serbia's Yugoslavia situation, was the turning point was the Second World War, when Serbia went from a kingdom to socialism or communism. And there was a huge confiscation of individual property rights, huge problem with normal folk and with my family. All our property was confiscated, and it's still confiscated as of today. And we still haven't learned from that. We are seeing the repetition again, not in the East, in the Eastern Bloc, but now we're seeing this happening in the Western Bloc. I know we're doing our best to try and stop that. The crowd, people over here, are us freedom maximists, Bitcoin maximists over here. But it's something that I'm scared about, that I see in Western media with this neoliberalism, this liberal disease that's happening over the West, that we are repeating what happened around the Second World War, or just before the Second World War, with the advent of communism. And I think that now we have that Bitcoin helps to stop that, because Bitcoin is all about individual property rights, and that's something that's really paramount. And now we have something that's unconfiscatable, and that's beautiful. So it gives me a lot of hope.
Rune?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, I must say. This is very special for me. And to be on this panel is an honor. This is a topic that I care deeply about. And what you were asking was, what is it with us not being able to learn from history and the mistakes that have been done in the past? I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that the history books are written by the winners. That's an old saying, it's kind of true. And also, I think the history books and also many of the other books, they don't include very much about the importance of the monetary system. And the monetary system is the very base level, at least when it comes to the infrastructure for a civilization. It's the very base level. I often talk about the monetary system as level 1, and then we have the belief system, broadly speaking, as a level 0. So we sort of get the type of monetary system which reflects what kind of belief system, broadly speaking, that the population and the leaders have. These are topics which are not reflected on at all. I think at least the monetary system and the relationship with the belief system, you don't learn about it in the schools, and you don't have anything about it in the religious texts like the Bible and the Quran. So you don't learn anything about this anywhere. You really have to look for the information and be proactive. And previously it was mainly only the gold bug community and some Austrian economists who were interested in this. So it was difficult to get access to the information. That's improving a lot these days, I must say. It's very much thanks to the Bitcoin community. You guys have been the best educators in the field of economics and money, ever, I would say. So congrats to that.
Before I pass it on to Erik, I'll just reflect on that for a second. You know, I think it's easy and it's true that oftentimes the blame is ours, right? We don't sufficiently educate ourselves, we don't sufficiently educate our families, and this makes it a lot easier for us to be taken advantage of in a variety of ways, politically, financially, economically, and otherwise. And so there is this element that, you know, it all does come back to the individual, and I think many people listening would be receptive to that. But there is this, you know, the reality of force in the world and the way that things have been structured, perhaps as a result of the imperfections in property all the way back to the axis that Saylor was talking about, is that it required an authority structure around it in order to administrate it, to secure it, to transfer it, all those things. And so that authority structure can obviously become corrupted. And there's a sense that, like, well, you can be educated as you want, but if you're, you know, a pleb on some feudal property in the Dark Ages and you recognize everything that's going wrong, and you're like Erik on the street corner just going crazy telling people about stuff, well, what the hell are you going to do about it? And so, there's this, I don't know how much that can be transcended. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why we're all so motivated and enthusiastic about Bitcoin is because it now flips this process where you, in taking that responsibility to educate yourself and then to secure your own property, it doesn't need to be force met with force. You can demonetize what's funding the force, and in so doing, not only secure yourself, but contribute to the change systemically that you might have been railing about earlier but had no ability to do anything about because you were up against such an unequal force, let's say. So Erik, I know you've thought a lot about those concepts. Why don't you hit us all with it now?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand, first of all, that we live in a very unique time and age where not only is the lessons from history forgotten, but there's a totally alternative history that we're told about. Like my favorite one is World War II, about like, we're the good guys, we went in, defeated them bad Nazis, and freedom won, hooray. Like, that's bullshit. Like, there was a lot of very, very fucked up and horrible things that came out of World War II, specifically from the American side. And I think it's really important that you understand that, like, as Americans who led this, freedom and stuff, like, there was a very dark and implicit socialist agenda in the United States where the American government seized everybody's gold very directly. They sent men with guns to their houses and to their banks and said, give us all of your bullion or you will go to jail. And so pretty much everybody forked over their gold, and there really wasn't much you could do about it. And what's unique with Bitcoin now is if you're securing it with self-custody and unique in all of the formats that we use, I prefer multi-sig personally, but we now have a plethora of different ways to secure them. Men with guns can't just show up to your house and demand you give your Bitcoin. They don't know how much Bitcoin you have. They don't know how it's necessarily secured. They don't even know if you can have it. And so I think when looking at how history has been manipulated and changed with these stories and pairing it with the new technologies that we have, it's very important to understand that the same consequences that used to come up throughout history no longer necessarily apply to us. And for me, this is what I'm the most interested for us moving forward with history is looking at all of the consequences of these terrible events that have happened throughout human history. How can we actually prevent us from even getting to that point? And to me, one of the most important ones is understanding that since World War II, the trajectory of the world has been one of the entire global economy has been committed towards governments and statism and fundamentally war economies. And that's been the development. And we've had no choice in it. We've had to willingly give up our taxes or go to jail. And there hasn't been any meaningful way to resist that we can now actually actively engage with. And I think it's very important that, particularly with seeing how wild stuff is getting, there's an opportunity for us to secure for our children and their children and onward a totally new type of system, not only of money and wealth, but fundamentally of politics itself by using these tools. And that, I really want you guys to understand that. Because like this isn't about number goes up. This is about making sure that your children don't live in a technological panopticon where the very concept of privacy and freedom is foreign to them. So please take it very seriously.
Amen. Amen.
I fully agree with that. Amazing points. I don't even know where to begin. Why do we keep repeating history? I think a couple words that came to mind of what you said originally was hubris. Hubris, and I like the way you put it, that we're in the recent chain or the recent link of history. And I think World War II is the obvious most recent link or event in history where we have that peak societal cannibalism, right? And obviously Fiat accelerates that. And that's the horrible truth, that yes, you have the Nazis that did horrible things, but then you have the Soviets that also did horrible things. You have the British and the Americans, obviously, we're talking varying degrees of culpability and destruction, but the horrible thing with this previous link we're looking at and that we're still in is political currency requires that increasing centralized control, right? And so it's like when one clamps down and destroys its own society at an exponentially faster rate, we have these others doing it. And I just think back to that point about hubris is that we look at the past and I think we assume we're much smarter than people 100 years ago. We assume we're much smarter than people 1,000 years ago. And I don't think we are. I don't think we are at all. I think the only difference is that we have a different technological uses, we have different technological experiences, right? Like many people alive today could not survive 1,000 years ago, probably not even 200 years ago. Like they use different technology then, we use different technology now. And when I was originally trying to understand Bitcoin, and if I actually thought it was going to have an impact on the world, one of the things I thought about was, why do I keep repeating history? And one of the things I kept coming back to is that idea that we have less in common technologically with the future and the past. And I think because of that, we isolate ourselves mentally thinking this is the way it always has been, or this is the way it obviously was always going to be. And those primitive people of 100 years ago, when they thought the plane was impossible, they were all, idiots. Or when they thought the train would kill people and if it's not possible, we just assume that because they don't see it, we see it, they're idiots, right? And I think because we assume, oh, well, obviously we see it and they don't, and we just forget that we have biases, they have biases, then that own hubris we have today of assuming, oh, we're better, we're smarter, we're channeling more energy than ever before, and then we just assume we can be moral enough and virtuous enough to be the ones in control of energy.
Which is a massive assumption. I totally agree with your point, and I think everyone would agree. It's like, you're right. We look around and we say, look, we have TVs and airplanes, and you guys, didn't even have cars. What a bunch of idiots. We're de facto smarter, and therefore, all the lessons you learned, we absorb through osmosis just by living in the modern world. And you could make the case that all of our material productivity, efficiency, innovation, while I'm sure we appreciate much of it, it has a flip side that it can distract us. It can cause us to feel overly hubristic or confident about what we know and what we've actually contributed to all this. And I think this is why, and I'm sure this is the case for many of you, you get into Bitcoin for number go up, for separating money and state, whatever your initial motivation might be. And then as you start going down the rabbit hole, you keep trying to contextualize this thing. What is the relevance of this thing? What is the relevance of this thing? And you keep asking that question and asking it, and you come on every segment of society, politics, economics, spirituality, religion, and you start to realize, like, maybe I don't, just by virtue of being a modern person, have the correct perspective on all these things. Maybe just by listening to the news and getting exposure to the, whatever information you get accidentally or haphazardly, maybe that doesn't instill in you a perspective grounded in truth. So again, we come back to this point that you do have to do the work to try to right that perspective. And as you do, especially in Bitcoin land, you start to realize maybe things are actually inverted. And I'm not saying for everything, but maybe a lot of the things we were taught in school, or these de facto assumptions that we've had growing up, maybe in some cases the exact opposite is true. And that can be a very destabilizing realization, because then you're kind of like your world falls apart and you have to reconstruct it. And I would say that, I'm sure it's the case for everyone on this panel and many of you, that's actually one of the things I love the most about this journey, is that we're reconstructing a perspective in truth to the extent that we can. I wouldn't be so bold as to say, well, now we know the truth and we have a truthful perspective. But I think at a minimum, we are attempting to ground it in a greater form of truth than we ever had. And that means revisiting all of our past assumptions. And like has been said on this panel so far, I do think that was a massive, that's part of our hubris, and that's why we don't learn. History is replete with lessons. But why are we not learning them? I think it's partially because of that.
And I want to point out, this is a really important fact that you just brought up, is that we are taught history. You are taught things. Being taught something is fundamentally different from questioning. And you were taught that money was the right way and that it worked right. That you were taught that you're supposed to work at a job and that you're supposed to save money. You were taught that you're supposed to get a home, have kids, send them to school. These were all things that you were told to do, and that was banked into you. The difference with Bitcoin is when it comes up and you finally scratch your head enough and start questioning it, and then it finally clicks and you go, oh, there's something different here, I'm learning. Now you're actually doing the real process of teaching yourself, which is questioning. And when you start questioning things, that finally gives you access to actually challenge the narratives that you've been, because for the very first time in your life, you're actually starting to learn things on your own. And that only comes through the action of questioning. And that's the flaw in history, is most of us are taught a certain version of history, which is not necessarily true. Whereas when you question what history has been, that allows for you to go through the actions that actually has you come to understand what the truth is and not the narrative that you have been given. And so I think that that's a really important thing that Bitcoin imparts to us, is to understand how to actually question things in a meaningful way so that we can come to the conclusions for ourselves of what actually is true.
I'd like to add something about, well, one method that they've always used is bread and circus, propaganda. And it's quite fitting that here we are in a stadium in the modern form of sort of bread and circus, talking about the thing that's going to stop the bread and circus from continuing, and propaganda. I have to say that what happened in 2020 was a masterclass of propaganda, and a lot of the world fell for it. That was COVID. The pandemic was a turnkey event for totalitarianism, and they failed. I think they failed. They've tried. Of course, they're going to be trying new methods on us, but more and more people are becoming aware. I can feel it. I'm sure a lot of you feel it. There's a great awakening happening, and this is thanks to the methods that we have today of the propaganda, the methods that they have, that they use propaganda against us, the tools like the internet, TV, and all that. But now we have the internet that created Bitcoin, that created base layer money, that created individual property rights that you can't take away. So it's quite a sweet irony, actually, a sweet justice. I don't know how to describe it, but the very technology being used against us is also going to be the technology that's going to save us.
Well, I also think that it's very important to try to understand the positive things that have happened in the past, not only learning from the mistakes. And I have written 2 books on which both are about money and the history of monetary policy and monetary technology. And there was one very important concept that came up, which we have forgot about, and that is the very concept of monetary freedom, which means the right that everybody has to use the money that you like best. This is something that Bitcoiners care a lot about. We want to use Bitcoin freely, with as little regulation as possible, and with no taxation. We don't want to have a capital gains tax, etc. We want this to function as money, as the best form of money that is possible. The reason why I bring this up is because it's easier to hope for something which has already been in the past than hoping for something new that might be able for us to achieve in the future without having any sort of reference in the past. So to understand, in addition that the Irish people, they also had monetary freedom well into the 1600s. That's not very, it's not so very distant past from today. And even more important, you have all heard probably Milei Javier, the new president of Argentina. He talks about monetary freedom and currency competition, and he wants to return back to the system they had in Argentina from 1816 to about 1880. And also in the United States, they had monetary freedom as a de facto principle from the end of the revolution in 1783 and until 1857. This is a very valuable concept. And it's easier for us to believe that we can achieve important things with Bitcoin if we sort of understand that this has happened before. This has been the situation before in our civilization. And this is something that we can do one more time in the not so distant future. That we will be freely allowed to use Bitcoin, spend Bitcoin, own Bitcoin freely. Have this as a basic human right. We have had it before as a de facto principle, and we can do it one more time.
We have to learn from the good things that happen in history and the bad, but I also think perhaps to answer the question of this talk, one of the reasons why we perhaps to continue to repeat mistakes is because we sometimes attempt to solve problems that we confront in the now with solutions from the past. You know, one very obvious one today is as things begin to deteriorate under the fiat system and as that bleeds into politics and economics, there's going to be a lot of frustration, angst, all of that kind of stuff that bubbles up along with it. And there's going to be, you need an outlet for that. And people are going to be looking for solutions to their perceived problems. And so, you know, to put it in simple terms, oftentimes throughout history, revolutions were, you know, storm the Bastille sort of thing, right? Force against force. And then we'll institute the system that is fair and just and not corrupt. And maybe for a time that's actually true. Maybe the good guys do win, and for a period of time they implement something that is fair and just, or as free as it can be for as many people. But I think one of the things you really have to recognize, and a study of history and a study in appreciation for what's happening currently is required, is to recognize when the strategy should change. You know, Erik and I have had a number of discussions over the last few years about, well, should Bitcoin become explicitly political? And should we, you know, should there be whatever, revolts of various kinds against all the craziness that we've been seeing? And I'm not de facto disagreeing with Erik's position, but it may be the case, and I think this is my position, that we have a new technological paradigm at our disposal to fight these battles. And can we use that to do so in a way that's way less dangerous, way less conflict, way less bloodshed, and more importantly, perhaps, more sustainable? You know, I opened this up by saying, you know, questioning whether the arc of history does bend toward justice. And maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't. We can have that debate. But I think we can all agree that maybe freedom waxes and wanes. And we go through periods where there's not much freedom and periods where there is, and it kind of goes like that. And so maybe our goal or our objective here is to just extend out the periods that we can establish freedom in and build on top of that. And so I think one of the ways we can avoid making the same mistakes that we've made in the past is recognizing when different technologies and strategies are available to confront what are basically eternal problems, oppressor and oppressed.
If I could add to that with the cycles. So from America, I think of Boston when it comes to those cycles, in that how we have periods of tyranny, periods of freedom, periods of tyranny, and it seems like it's getting more volatile as the rate of technological change gets faster. And I remember being in Boston for the first time at a Bitcoin event, Bitcoin conference a while ago, and in the harbor, right, the Boston Harbor, Boston Tea Party, that's where the, like you just said, revolution, revolt, whatever you want to call it, is where it began, right? Dump the tea in the harbor. And to me, the incredible thing with me being there and experiencing that was not the bay and like, oh, this is actually where it was. It was that the Federal Reserve Building of Boston in the U.S. is across the street from where that happened. And so these people, just a couple hundred years ago, in early America, were fighting this tyranny that we read about in history books, that were taught in history books, that were these wonderful patriots, and you know, saved the country, saved the people. And they had these wooden ships where tea was so scarce that that was the commodity that was infuriating enough. I mean, that is tea, right? It's unimaginable to me, in my modern lens, that tea would be that valuable. And it's unimaginable that America exchanged a foreign monetary god, you know, 3,000 miles across the ocean for one literally 300 feet across the street, the Federal Reserve Building, you know, and it's a bigger building than anything in London at the time. You know, to me, that's your point with the cycles, is that that's the concern, is that how many people have to die in world wars? How many revolutions do we have to have? How many of those cycles do we have to have before we realize there's no stopping that cycle? It's just going to grow, get more volatile, accelerate with larger body counts every single time, perpetually, indefinitely. I believe, unless we can find a way to detach human emotion, incentives, and greed from the creation and management of monetary policy, right? I mean, to me, that's what, it's such an honor to be here. And, you know, I mean, like what Saylor said, you know, barely an hour ago on the stage, is that, you know, he was wrong. He said he was wrong about Bitcoin, right? And that, you know, I mean, he didn't say it directly, but basically, you know, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you, right? Obviously, it's a cliche at this point. But, you know, and then, you know, in the second panel with Jack and Alex and Jeff, it's same thing with communication, right? And so I hope we don't have to continue those cycles, because I think everyone inherently is going to be worse than the last, right? How do you explain the atrocities of the Nazis in World War II and the nuclear bomb to people with technology from the past? How do we explain the atrocities of 2 cycles from now? Forget now, like, how do we articulate that to today? Like, to me, that's terrifying, and I don't know, I think Bitcoin is the best. Divorcing human depravity from monetary policy, I think, is the best shot at reducing the probability of those negative events.
Well, and to be clear, like the American Revolution just didn't start one day. They're like, hey, these guys suck. Like, let's rise up and like defeat them. No, there was new pieces of technology that allowed them to do that. Most importantly was the Gutenberg printing press. The Americans were really good at propaganda because they could churn out papers really quick. And propaganda and being able to print their own papers about the kind of tyranny that was going on in America was how they were able to actually spread that revolution, was because they could print out papers, spread them out, organize, and now they actually had a real chance. We're at the same precipice right now with what Nostr and Bitcoin introduces as a new technological technique of freedom. There are 2 distinct paths for our future. One is going to be technological fascism. You will have no freedom, you will have no privacy, your government will know everything about you, and they will know every single cent that you spend. Or you can choose to resist it and fight back with new technologies like Bitcoin and Nostr so that you can have private communication. You can use cryptography to protect yourself, and you can free yourself and your children from needing to repeat this cycle repeatedly. We all have a responsibility here to actually go talk about what this technology is, and it is not about number go up or about post whatever crazy shit you want online. This is about us being able to actually freely have dialogue with one another about the future that we want to have. And one of the truths specifically here from Madeiran people that I want you to take on is that being a unique, isolated nation, island nation that's out here in the Atlantic, you can make a decision to perhaps choose a different direction where you're not associated with the EU, in the same way that the United States, individual states can start making a choice to distance themselves from the federal government. But this is only going to be a possibility if we leverage and utilize the techniques of freedom, very similar to how the American revolutionaries did. We can do that for ourselves, but it's going to take a very strong commitment from each one of us to talk to our friends, our families, our associates, and coworkers about why this thing is so important, and you need to pay attention to something other than just number go up, but more about the freedom that it entails.
Eric, that point makes me think of something that was kind of the crux of Saylor's discussion, but I remember having conversations with you during the COVID time, and I reflected on this. But maybe it is one of those things that we fail to learn from history, and that is, you are in history. You just go through life and you have stresses and you have obligations, and you just kind of, you try to make ends meet and you try to have a few kicks along the way. And you forget that history is a result of your behavior just as much as it is anybody else's. And that confers a tremendous responsibility. Like, what are you going to do to tilt that arc of history toward justice and freedom and progress? And I think that point is exceptional, and Bitcoin is the thing that empowers us, perhaps most likely more than anything in history, to do that, and Nostr, and these things that liberate us and give us, this is another thing that you made me think about, is how it emboldens us. I think everyone here is a grade of revolutionary just for being in Bitcoin. And the amazing thing is that you can just Bitcoin as hard as you can, and you don't need to storm the Bastille. If you do that for yourself, and you do that for your family, and you do that for your community, then that is the revolutionary act of you taking back sovereignty and freedom for yourself. And to your point about communication, the printing press and the books and pamphlets that were going around during the revolution, all of this emboldens us to be able to speak what we believe to be true more than ever before. I'm sure we've all self-censored before. We're at work, we're online, we're on Twitter, whatever, and we take an edge off it, we take a different angle because we don't want to be canceled, we don't want to be suspended, we don't want to get fired. And we have this thing now where we're gaining so much sovereignty over our own lives, and we're disallowing anyone to disintermediate that or to impose on that. We can actually say, yeah, I'm going to say what the fuck I think is true. I'm going to say what I believe in, and there's a tremendous power in that. And the more people that can do that, the more I think we're going to realize, oh, you seem to value the same things I do. You think in a similar way. You think this is unjust. You think this is where we should be headed. And if we can all just have the courage and use the tools that bestow that courage to speak what we believe to be most true, I think we get to transcend a lot of the problems that we've confronted in history. And I think Bitcoin and technologies like Nostr and others that I'm sure will emerge are granting us that opportunity. And again, as is so often said, thank God for it.
Yeah. Just to echo that, yeah, us, you guys, everyone here, Bitcoiners in general, we are changing history. We're the ones, you know, being an individual is what's going to change history, being yourself. And I think we can't stop changing history, because if we don't stop, then we're doomed to repeat it. So really, everyone continue what you're doing, spread the word, work on yourself, and yeah, just keep on being great Bitcoiners.
I think the points that Erik brought up here, they are very important. And I think we can say as a matter of almost a law, that the better we are at utilizing these tools, these new tools, the less violent this revolution will become. And another thing is that the power of ideas it's enormous. So the better we are at sharing these ideas with our friends, our families, our communities, the more valuable these ideas will become. So I'm kind of optimistic for the future when I'm seeing what we already have achieved, and I truly believe that we will be able to create, to form, to shape our own future if we work together. And if we are optimistic and utilize these fantastic tools that we have now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that's the process of recognizing that you are a part of history and stepping into your role and responsibility of history. And, you know, in these sorts of discussions, we often, dismiss somewhat the role of NGU, right? You know, yet we're talking about these deeply political, impactful things. But the kicker here that makes all of this so much easier is that there seems to be a tremendous value in truth and freedom. And as that's represented in the mechanism that's permitting us access to that truth and freedom, the more people that do that, the more people that accept that responsibility and secure their own freedom for themselves, well, the more you're rewarded in a sense for that. And so not only do you access more freedom and sovereignty in your life and for your family, but you also access more economic freedom, which means you can access more of the optionality of the world, which means you have more options to move through the world. And so you get the best of both worlds, right? You get to be free and you get to be rich, in a sense. And so has there ever been a better revolution than that, I guess is my point.
Yeah. Yes, we're all going to get rich because we love truth and freedom. And while that's a bit cheeky,
Exactly.
It's actually true. Because when we talk about this idea of value, the real value that Bitcoin has is it reestablishes true law. And when I say true law, I mean the government can't come in with a unilateral decree and print out trillions of more dollars or euros or whatever your base currency is, and they can't utilize their power as government to steal from you. And it turns out that the radicalism of the equality of law and what Bitcoin achieves as a kind of law for each of us is the greatest value that we could ask for in the technological age, because no longer do you need to ask for the EU, the American government, or anybody else to protect your right and protect your wealth. But the facts of cryptography and the way that mathematics alone and the truth that it is, that can actually protect your wealth. And that is worth more than anything humanity has discovered till now. And I encourage each and every one of you, if you came here for Number Go Up, allow for yourself to dive deeper down the rabbit hole and get more curious and really try to understand what's going on here at a deeper level, because you will be surprised at how much this will change your ideas and change you as a person as well.
I think, simply put, that's the mistake in history we repeat. We want to believe the lie that if I was in charge, everything would be okay. And the hope with Bitcoin is that it offers a technological solution saying you don't have to convince yourself of that lie. And so when people try to day trade that It's like trying to day trade truth in terms of lies. It's like the value of truth in terms of lies is going up forever.
Boom. What an amazing way to close us out. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to the panel for joining me. Enjoy the rest of the conference.